Section 21. Reading the closing disclosure like an agent. When the real estate numbers matter. The loan is right, but the contract isn't. Emily and Carlos are officially homeowners. The deed recorded, the keys were released according to the transaction, and Carlos has already started planning where the television will go. Sarah could mentally move the transaction into the closed column. But before we leave the closing disclosure behind, let's rewind to something that happened earlier that week. When Emily reviewed the document, she noticed the seller credit didn't look right. That moment teaches Arizona agents one of the most important lessons in this course. You may not be responsible for calculating the buyer's mortgage, but you should know what your own real estate contract says. The closing disclosure is not just a loan document. Agents often look at the closing disclosure and think, that's the lender's paperwork. Partly, but look closer. The closing disclosure can also contain information directly connected with the real estate transaction. Purchase price, deposits, seller credits, certain adjustments, settlement charges, real estate commissions, amounts due from or to the parties. Those numbers didn't appear out of nowhere. Many of them trace directly back to the purchase contract, amendments, addenda, escrow instructions, and other transaction information. That's where Sarah has an important role. Start with the purchase price. Let's look at an example. Emily and Carlos originally contracted to purchase the Gilbert home for $500,000. After the appraisal issue, the parties signed an amendment, reducing the purchase price to $490,000. Sarah reviews the closing figures and sees $500,000. What should she do? Speak up. She knows the executing contract was amended. Sarah doesn't need to know how the lender's software works. She doesn't need to rewrite the closing disclosure. She simply needs to say, the executed amendment changed the purchase price to $490,000. Can we confirm the closing figures reflect the current contract? That's good transaction management. The forgotten amendment. Here's where the problem often begins. The parties negotiate something during the inspection period. Everyone signs an amendment. The buyer's agent saves it. The listing agent saves it. But nobody sends it to escrow. Weeks later, Maria prepares settlement figures using the original contract. Now everybody is shocked. How did escrow miss this? Maybe escrow never received it. This is why we've repeated the same lesson throughout this course. A transaction change has to travel. Executed documents need to reach the professionals who rely on them. What about earnest money? Carlos sees the purchase price and then asks, where's the earnest money we already paid? The buyer's deposit can be reflected in the transaction summary and affect the amount ultimately due from the buyer. If Carlos deposited earnest money earlier in the transaction, he should not assume that money disappeared. Sarah can help verify the amount stated in the purchase contract and transaction file. If the closing disclosure appears to show the wrong deposit, she should contact Maria. Again, Sarah doesn't personally edit the settlement figures. She identifies the discrepancy. Seller credits need attention. Now let's revisit Emily's earlier concern. Suppose the seller agreed through a properly executed amendment to provide a $10,000 credit toward allowable buyer costs. Emily sees only $5,000 reflected. Sarah should not say, I'm sure that's right. She should check the contract. If the contract says $10,000, Sarah should bring that information to Jason and Maria. Maybe there's a financing limitation. Maybe only part of the negotiated amounts can be used under the loan requirements. Maybe the disclosure is wrong. The point is that Sarah shouldn't guess. She knows what the seller agreed to provide. The lender can explain any financing limitation. Escrow can explain how the amount is reflected. Prorations can look strange. Then Carlos finds another number. What's this tax adjustment? Real estate transactions often involve prorations or adjustments between buyer and seller. Property taxes are a common example. Depending on the timing of the transaction and the amounts involved, the parties may need credits or debits to allocate responsibility according to the contract and settlement process. These numbers can confuse buyers because they may not look like a simple fee. Sarah should understand the basic transaction concept, but allow Maria to explain the specific escrow calculation. If Carlos asks, why is it exactly $1,843.27? That's a Maria question. Sarah doesn't need to reproduce the settlement software with a calculator. The closing disclosure may also show certain real estate commissions or other transaction charges. This can create questions. Carlos might say, wait, who is paying this? The answer should be based on the transaction agreements and applicable settlement arrangements, not assumptions. Agents should understand how their compensation is being handled through the brokerage and transaction, but they should not casually modify settlement instructions or accept compensation outside the employing broker. If something involving commission appears incorrect, involve the designated broker or appropriate brokerage personnel and escrow. Here's where agents get into trouble. Imagine Sarah notices the seller credit is wrong, but says nothing because escrow will catch it. Maria assumes Sarah reviewed the contract terms. Jason assumes escrow has the final amendment. Emily assumes Sarah checked everything. Everyone assumes somebody else handled it. Then the transaction consummates with the wrong figure. This may seem like a small issue, but it can become a major complaint. Professional transaction management means questioning something when you have information showing it may be incorrect. Know what you know and what you don't. Sarah should know what purchase price did the parties agree to, what earnest money deposit was required, what seller credit was negotiated, was there an amendment, did the closing date change, were there contractual concessions that need to be reflected. Sarah doesn't need to independently verify the mathematical accuracy of the APR, the lender's finance charge calculations, the regulatory treatment of every tolerance category, the underwriting calculations. That's the boundary. What would you do? Imagine you're Sarah. The contract provides a $7,500 seller credit. The closing disclosure shows $4,000. The lender says that's all the buyer can use. What do? Don't simply tell the seller they now get to keep the difference. Don't tell the buyer the lender is wrong. Find out what the loan requirements permit, and then determine what the purchase contract says happens under the circumstances. This may require coordination among the buyer, lender, escrow officer, agents, and brokers. The key is not making assumptions about money. Broker tip. Contract numbers deserve a second look. Before consummation, compare the important real estate terms against the closing figures. Purchase price, deposit, seller credits, major contractual adjustments. If something doesn't match, ask why. You don't have to audit the entire closing disclosure. You do need to recognize when your transaction is being closed using numbers that appear inconsistent with the parties' agreement. Emily and Carlos's transaction numbers are now correct, but Carlos notices another section of the closing disclosure. It shows costs paid by different parties, and he asks, Sarah, why is the seller paying some of my costs? And who actually decides who pays what? That takes us into our next lesson: seller paid costs, concessions, credits, and how contract negotiations eventually appear on the closing disclosure. Online discussion. 1. Sarah sees the original $500,000 purchase price on the closing disclosure, even though the parties executed an amendment reducing the price to $490,000. What should she do? Answer. Sarah should promptly notify the appropriate lender and settlement professionals and provide the executed amendment showing the current purchase price. She should not modify the closing disclosure herself, but she has direct knowledge of the contractual terms and should make sure the discrepancy is investigated before consummation. 2. The contract provides a $10,000 seller credit, but only $5,000 appears to be reflected on the closing disclosure. Why shouldn't Sarah immediately assume the disclosure is wrong? Answer. The discrepancy needs investigation, but financing requirements may affect how a negotiated seller credit can actually be applied. Sarah should verify the contractual amount and coordinate with the lender and escrow professional. The lender can explain any loan-related limitation, while escrow can explain how the credit is reflected in the settlement figures. 3. Why should Sarah understand the difference between verifying contract information and auditing lender calculations? Answer. Sarah is responsible for competently managing the real estate transaction and should know important terms such as the purchase price, deposits, credits, and amendments. She is not the mortgage compliance professional responsible for calculating APR, finance charges, or underwriting figures. Understanding that boundary allows her to protect the client without providing advice outside her role.